Good morning. I wasn't too sure what the caption would say, so thank you very much, Olivia, for that. That's quite good. Right. So, when that went on, what was your first thought? Now, most of you are rugby league fans, so that would not relate to any of you, really. But I'm a football fan. And when I was thinking about my talk about the hand of God, immediately I thought about the Madonna goal.
Yeah.
Maradona, I mean. Oh, well. I think he made as much money as Madonna with that one goal, actually. The interesting thing is that even till his dying day, he still said it was the hand of God. And Gary Lineker did a commentary and did an interview with him, and he still said, no, it was definitely a hand of God. If you're old enough to remember the 1986 finals in Mexico, that happened. But the amazing thing is, and I'm not going to talk about him all thing, but 4 minutes later, he scored the wonder goal of the competition because he dribbled past 5 England defenders, and then he dribbled past Peter Shilton, and he scored a wonder goal that earned him the reputation of being a superstar. But I want to talk this morning not about his hand. I want to talk about the hand of God. You know, this might sound corny, but I love seeing babies' hands. We've got 2 little babies here. You know, I'm a granddad. You know I'm a granddad. I talk about our grandkids all the time. And whenever we go for a walk, which is not often at the moment, but when we do, I love it when, especially because Lyra's about there, Luna's probably about there, but when they were both small, they would put the hand up and I had to stoop down, or else I got backache, you know. But I just love holding my grandkid's hand, you know. And I just want to talk about this morning about the hand of God, as recorded in the Old and the New Testament. You know, in the Old Testament, we see the hand of God in acts of protection, provision, guidance, comfort, and judgment in the lives of Abraham, Moses, Joseph, David, Jonah. If you've been with us for the last few weeks on a Tuesday night, Pastor Paul's been doing the study about Jonah and how he ran away from God, yet God had his hand on him. But this morning I want to talk and draw attention to a book in the Old Testament which if you're doing your Bible study, from the 1st of January you should be now in about Exodus. But I've been catching up with a study that I was doing Bible reading I was doing last year. So I've just finished Daniel, and the book of Daniel is a wonderful book. And I want to talk about, for a short time, about 4 characters from the book of Daniel. Now, I'm not going to try and pronounce all the names. So, first of all, there's Belteshazzar, who's actually, we know him as Daniel, who wrote the book. Then there's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And if you went to Sunday school, you learnt those names, you know. But I want to look at the book of Daniel. But before I give you something and share with you about the book of Daniel, I found out something really interesting about a couple of months ago. Did you know the Bible was written in 3 languages? It was written, first of all, most of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. I knew that. The New Testament is written in Greek, but I was doing some stuff. I'm doing some studies, some Bible studies, and I found out that half of the book of Daniel and the first 2 chapters of Ezra were written in Aramaic. And that blew my mind because that's the language that Jesus spoke most of the time to the disciples, and when he was in Galilee, they speak Aramaic. So the book that I have just finished and I've really enjoyed reading, half of it, I don't know which half, maybe Stephen can tell me at the end, which half was written in Aramaic. But I found that was amazing. And I was challenged, when would I ever use that information? Well, I've just used it today. There, yeah? So you've got a bit of knowledge that I've just gained recently. So, the backstory to the book of Daniel is that King Nebuchadnezzar has been coming to Israel, and should we say coming to the tribe of Judah and to the land of Judah, and after many attempts has finally breached the walls, and he's taken captive some of the young men, some of the Hebrew young men, and he's taken them off to Babylon. And these young men, these 4 young men, have been put in the charge of the chief eunuch, and his job was to educate them and give them the best that Babylon could offer them. The best wine, the best food, everything that they could have. And his job was to make them fit for the king, because they were going to serve the king. Although they were exiles, although they were sort of Jews and Hebrews, they were being trained up to serve the king. Now in chapter 1 of Daniel, we see these lads, these 4 lads. They're there and they do something quite unusual. All the best is offered to them. But they say to this eunuch, we don't want the best. We just want vegetables. They were the original vegans, you could say, because all they wanted was vegetables. And they wanted to just have those vegetables. And they said, okay, we believe that God is with us. We believe that God has got his hand upon us. And if you just give us vegetables for the next 10 days, we believe that God will look after us. And if you read Daniel chapter 1, verses 15 to 17, after this period of 10 days, the eunuch is gobsmacked. It won't say that in the Bible, okay? That's my interpretation, right? But they're absolutely gobsmacked because in appearance, they look healthier than those of the other young men that this eunuch was dealing with. They look better in appearance. And in the whole training, their wisdom was far better than those who were of the other men. So much so that they were presented to the king, and the king was amazed how these men were smarter and wiser than all the other wise men that were being presented to him, all the native wise men. God had his hand upon their lives, even by a change of diet. They honoured God. Because if they'd have taken what was offered, they were convinced that it was offered to idols, it was offered to other people, it was offered to gods that they didn't want to honour. But in honouring God and stepping out in faith, God honoured them as well. Now in chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar, and if you read Daniel, you'll see his name mentioned many times, he has a dramatic dream. And in this dream he sees a figure, and he sees it's got different aspects of gold and stuff like that. And he wakes up and he's perplexed. And he calls for his wise men and for the sorcerers to come and to explain the dream to him, but also to actually not only explain it, but to interpret what it means. And the sorcerers, the wise men, just couldn't get a handle. They couldn't understand what was happening here. They couldn't interpret the dream. They couldn't explain what was happening in this dream. And King Nebuchadnezzar got so wound up and so annoyed that he just said, right, do away with the lot. And an edict went out that basically every wise man had to be destroyed. But Daniel, this young man, knowing that God's hand was upon him, he intervened. And Daniel, through listening to God and hearing God, he was able to not only come and calm the king down, he was able to explain what the dream meant and interpret the dream. And the amazing thing is, once again, because of God's hand upon Daniel's life, he was promoted through the ranks. But being promoted, it marked him out as a man who, unfortunately, made a lot of people jealous. You can read this in Daniel chapter 2. Now, isn't it funny how so often people do things and God blesses them and God intervenes and then they forget? Does that ever happen to you? It's happened to me. It's happened to if you're really honest, God does something in our lives and we're amazed, and then we go back to the familiar route or the familiar thing, and we forget sometimes. And in chapter 3 of Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar has had this all explained to him, this dream, and yet, in being directed by some of his wise men bearing in mind that Daniel and the 3 other Hebrew lads were being marked out as being special, they encouraged King Nebuchadnezzar to build a massive statue of himself. And in doing this, they announced that everyone has to bow down and worship the statue. The 4 Hebrew lads weren't just the only Israelites who were exiled. I'm sure there was many. And the proclamation went out through all the Babylonian Empire that of this statue they had to bow down. But God had his hand upon the 4 Hebrew lads. And in chapter 3 it talks about Meshach, let's get the names right. Even one of them, yes. Yeah. When I went to Sunday school, Linda, what was the nickname that your dad always used to have?
What?
Bendigo or something. What?
Shake the bed, make the bed, then to bed we go.
That's right. So I was not brought up in Linda's family, but obviously when I joined the family and we used to speak about this, I'd get back home and Linda's dad would say such and such a thing. So yeah. So I sometimes can't say the names because I'm always thinking about that. But so this proclamation has gone out, and all around the city, people are bowing down. Now, I don't know where Daniel was. That's one of the interesting things. When you read the Bible, when you ask Bible scholars, I'd love to, when I get to heaven, I'm going to find Daniel and say, you know, when he was called to bow down, where in Dickens were you? Because it doesn't say he was around. But the 3 Hebrew lads did a remarkable thing. They stood still. They stood still. What would you have done? What would you have done? Everybody else, I'm sure there was other members of their family, there was other members who had been exiled, were on their knees, but they stood still. Now there was a proclamation that not only did they have to worship, but if you didn't worship, you were going to be thrown into the furnace. What would you have done? You're facing a situation where if you don't conform, you face death. But these 3 Hebrew lads, knowing that God was with them and that they served God and not a false God, they stood still. So you can imagine the reaction. They're taken, they're seized, they're bound, and King Nebuchadnezzar is so enraged that he asks for the furnace to be stirred up 7 times hotter. And the guys who were actually stirring up the furnace, it was that hot they were killed. But eventually, it's so hot, these 3 Hebrew lads are thrown in. Now, it must have been a huge thing because the amazing thing is, the king was able to look into the furnace. Because it tells us, as he looks in, he's gobsmacked once again. Because he doesn't just see 3 Hebrew lads, he sees a 4th person that looks like the image of God. And they're walking around in the fire. Not harmed. They were wearing tunics, they were wearing sort of Middle Eastern clothes, robes and stuff. And the clothes didn't seem to be on fire. And there was 4 people walking around. So the king asked for them to come out. And the 3 lads came out. And if you read Daniel chapter 3, verses 25 to 28, it tells you that when they came out, there was no smell of fire. There was no soot or ash on their clothes, and none of their clothes were burnt. God had had his hand upon them, and God was with them in the midst of the fire. What an amazing thing. They took a step of faith. And although it resulted in them going into a fiery furnace, God was with them, and God protected them, and God kept them safe, even to the point that there was no smell of smoke or fire on their clothes. I'll come back to that in a minute. In Daniel chapter 5, we see now not King Nebuchadnezzar. He's gone. Now his son, King Belshazzar, holds a banquet, and this celebration, he's got all his generals and his lords and all his entourage, and they're having a massive banquet, and he declares to his servants, "Bring out the gold cups and the silver cups that my father took from the temple in Jerusalem. Distribute them to everybody, and let's fill them with wine, and let's praise our gods." And then the amazing thing happens. Not a full hand, but some pink fingers appear. And they start writing on the wall. Now, I'm not going to say the words because I'll probably get it wrong. Because my Arabic / Hebrew is not that brilliant. Give me a couple of years and I might be able to share. Maybe Stephen can come up here and share the words because he's probably learnt it. But the words were written on the wall. And the guy goes a whiter shade of pale. Absolutely stuck to his chair. He screams out in agony for someone to come and interpret what's the writing on the wall. And all the wise men come in, and they can't do anything. All the sorcerers come in, they can't do anything. And the wise Queen Mum says, "There's a guy here in your kingdom who, when your father was alive, was able to interpret dreams. Bring him in." So the king requests Daniel, who's a bit older now, to come in and to look at the writing on the wall and explain what it means. So Daniel comes in and tells him bluntly what it means. That basically God has weighed him in the scales and he's found wanting, and that his life will be taken from him shortly. On that very night, Belshazzar was killed, and then the next king was put in position, a guy called Darius. Daniel knew that God was in control of his life, and he was able to come into that situation, and the king was distraught, and he was able to speak into that situation and reveal God's will and purpose in that situation. Now, when we turn to chapter 6, we see that amazingly, and you read Daniel, it's mainly around Daniel this time, he's being promoted again in the court of Darius. And as I said earlier, he was a marked man. And the others in the court of Darius were sick and tired of this Jewish exile coming into their court and ruling in their position and being in charge of them in a sense. So they hatch a plan, and they ask King Darius to sign a decree that once again only one person could be worshipped, and that was the king. And the amazing thing is, Daniel knew what happened, knew about the signing of the declaration that only King Darius could be worshipped. And he goes into his room, as was his daily custom. He opens the windows, prays towards Jerusalem. He did that knowing that he would be watched, knowing that he was going against the declaration of King Darius. But once again, he knew that in doing that and taking a step of faith for God, God's hand was upon his life. Now, the sequence of events is that obviously the other wise men, the other sorcerers, tell King Darius that there's a subject of his that has disobeyed this order, and as a result, Darius had to sign the order that Daniel will be thrown into the lion's den. Now, it tells you in Daniel chapter 6 that Darius did this reluctantly because he honored Daniel. But he had to follow the edict, and the men take him and they throw him into the lion's den. But such is the power of God, and such is that God's hand was upon Daniel. God's hand shut the mouths of the lion. And although it was an overnight, Darius gets up early. I got up at 6 o'clock this morning on a Sunday. I got up early this morning. I was down here at 8:15 this morning. First one down here. I thought there'd be other people, but I was down here. Darius gets up at the break of dawn and shouts to Daniel, "Are you alive and well?" And Daniel says, "Yes, my God intervened and shut the mouths of the lion." So Daniel is lifted out, and the amazing thing is, and you read it in chapter 6, it is amazing. All those who conspired against Daniel, Darius gets them rounded up, and they're thrown into the lion's den. And they didn't even reach the bottom before the lions had a feeding frenzy. So much was God's hand upon Daniel that the lions didn't go near him. But when they smelt blood and when they smelt flesh, they ripped those who went against Daniel. They ripped their flesh from bones and sinews, etc. You know, we might not be in a situation where we have to bow down to an idol. We may not be in a situation where we have to go against an edict. But I want to tell you this morning, whatever situation you're going through, it might be hell, Jesus is in the midst. It might be heaven, Jesus is in the midst. But you say to me, that's easy for you to say, Tim. You don't know my situation. Yeah, that is very easy for me to say. But you don't know my situation. 15 years ago, I was in hell. And I came to this church. And we went through situations. And I want to thank God for this church helping me and Linda restore our marriage and many other things. I lost my job, as many of you know, in 2011. And Linda lost her job. We were both made redundant. God intervened and helped us in that situation. A year ago, Linda and our lodger had COVID. I think Linda passed it on to Stephen, but I'm not too sure it was the other way around. God intervened, and they're both well. And I don't think they've got any symptoms of long COVID. I believe that. This last year, you know, Linda's not been very well. For 4 years, she's been backwards and forwards to the hospital, backwards and forwards in agony with her gallbladder and stuff like that. And then eventually they found out what the problem was. And then we enjoyed a lovely diet, a boring diet of chicken. The highlight was prawns. You know, once a week we were allowed to have prawns. And now Linda's had the operation, we're allowed to go back to normality in a sense. So I don't know your situation, but you don't know ours. And whatever you're going through this morning, I want to encourage you, you're not on your own. God is with you. He has His hand on your life. And if that's hell this morning, God's there. Because that fire was real. And the three Hebrew lads weren't just walking around and it was just a little flame. That flame was hell. So much so that the people who tried to put them in were killed because of the heat. That was hell. And God was in the midst of their hell. And whatever your hell is, God is in the midst of it. And He will bring you through. The amazing thing is, both with Daniel and with the other Hebrew lads, they came out of the situation unscathed. Now, I can't guarantee that you won't be unscathed, but I can guarantee you God will bring you through that situation. God will bring you through that situation. I stand here this morning as a testimony of the fact that someone who messed up several years ago is restored, forgiven, redeemed, and everything else that you can think of. Because of God's love. We're recommitted to each other because of God's love. God brought us through. That's Daniel. You know, I don't know if I'll probably be too long. Stephen's looking at me with daggers. Probably haven't got a red notice yet. If we turn to the New Testament, we can see God's hands upon the lives of so many people in the New Testament. You think of Zechariah and Elizabeth. Very similar to Abraham and Sarah in the Old Testament, who were barren. Who Elizabeth was barren, and yet in her old age, she was able to produce a son, John the Baptist. God was on a a young girl, a young virgin by the name of Mary. And as the angel comes, and as he stands in front of her, she must have been thinking, what on earth is going on? And when he says, you're going to have a child, she must have thought, you're speaking rubbish. Of course, we don't see that in the Bible, but she must have thought, what are you going on about? And yet she says, okay, your will. God had his hand upon her life. You think of the disciples. They gave up so much to serve the Lord, and yet God was upon their lives. As they step out in faith, God was with them all the way. You think of Paul. You think of Saul, as he was. His passion, his fervour was to destroy the church of Jesus Christ. But God meets him on the way to Damascus, and then he's transformed. Just like Shirley said this morning, she was transformed. He was transformed. And that same passion, that same emotion, that same drive is now sees him going all over Europe and sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ. But in the New Testament, the wonderful thing is we don't just see the hand of God upon people's lives. We actually see and meet the actual Son of God. The one whose hands... Now, his hands weren't like my hands. I'm a pen pusher for my job. I'm a pen pusher, right? Cliff's probably on Zoom. He's a carpenter. Has been involved in the carpentry business. So he's got rough hands. I've got smooth, soft hands, right? So anybody who's been involved with the trades and stuff like that, your hands are not soft, right? I work with tradesmen in part of my job, and they ain't no soft hands, right? Jesus had not soft hands. Do you understand? He was a joiner. He was a chippy. He was brought up with Joseph, working in Joseph's carpentry store. So he was used to using his hands to work with timber. He wouldn't have white hands. If you see a picture of Jesus being white, it ain't Jesus. Jesus had Middle East skin, so he would have had olive skin. So this olive skin hands, rough from working with timber, touched and healed people. It cleansed lepers with his hands, touched blind eyes and made people completely see again. Wrote a message in the sand with his hand. So much so that all these accusers of the lady walked away and saved that lady. Still the waves and caught the bold, drowning Peter. Broke bread, the loaves and the fishes, and fed thousands of men and women and children. Those hands blessed the little children that came to him, the disciples tried to send away. You know, like me, I'm sure Jesus used his hands when he taught the people. You know, I said to Linda, where do we put this thing? She said, put it at the back. Stephen's put it at the back. So that's good so I can use my hands. And I'm sure Jesus, when he taught in the temple, wouldn't stand there like that. He would have used his hands. He was an expressive person, I believe. But you know the amazing thing this morning, and the thing that breaks my heart, those hands. God the Father allowed Jesus' hands, those hands that had healed people, those hands that had touched people, those hands that had blessed people, those hands that had done so much, to be laid on a cross and cruel nails. You just think of those nails. They weren't like nails that you have if you go down to B&Q. I was thinking about this morning at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's amazing what I think about 2 o'clock in the morning. But I was thinking about these nails. I suspect the nails had been reused many, many times. So those nails were bloody, DNA infested. From a health and safety point of view, they should have been thrown away. But they would have been prized out of somebody else's hands and put in a box. So there was all sorts of bacteria and everything on it. And those Roman soldiers shoved a nail in his hand and then took the hammer and rammed that nail through his hands. Took the nails and rammed it through his feet. The one who created, we're going to sing a song in a minute. I love this song. He took those hands that threw stars into space to cruel nails, surrendered for you and for me. That's love. Why? Why did he do that? So that you and I could be reconnected with God the Father. The one who, in Psalm 139:13 tells us, with his hands he knitted us together in our mother's wombs. I'm not very good at knitting. I'm useless at knitting. But God didn't make any mistakes. He didn't drop any pearls, or he didn't drop any stitches, or whatever you call it when you knit, when he made me. It might have maybe been a blessing if it had dropped the odd stitch, but we're perfect in God's sight because he knitted us together with those hands, those same hands that were laid on the cross in love for us.